The unexpected visitor. The wind howled outside the small wooden chalet, rattling the windows as James leaned back in his chair. Snow piled up higher with every passing hour, but he didn't mind. He had chosen this secluded cabin in the mountains for peace, away from the noise of the city and the endless distractions. His only company was the crackling fire in the hearth and the blank pages of his journal waiting to be filled. James rubbed his hands together and glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight, the darkest hour of the coldest night of the year. The thought made him smile. This was exactly what he had wanted. Complete isolation to write. Suddenly, there was a sound. A knock. James froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the snow falling from the roof. It was unmistakably a knock on the door. Who could it be at this hour? He muttered under his breath. The chalet was miles away from the nearest town, and no one knew he was here. His heart began to race. The knock came again, louder this time. 3 sharp, urgent taps. James stood, his legs feeling stiff. He walked slowly to the door, his mind racing with questions. Was it a lost traveler, a local in need of help, or something more sinister? He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. The cold from outside seemed to seep through the wooden door, chilling his fingers. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady but uncertain. No answer. The knock came again, more frantic now. James took a deep breath and unlocked the door, pulling it open just enough to peek outside. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. A woman stood there, trembling violently, her arms wrapped around herself. She was dressed in tattered clothing that seemed ill-suited for the freezing weather. But it wasn't her clothing or her pale, frost-bitten hands that caught James's attention. It was her eyes. They glowed faintly, like 2 small, shimmering stars. Her skin had an almost translucent quality, as if light could pass through it. Snowflakes melted as soon as they touched her, leaving tiny droplets that glistened like dew. "Please," she whispered, her voice so soft James barely heard it. "Help me." Without thinking, James opened the door wider. The icy wind rushed inside, biting at his skin, but he didn't care. The woman swayed on her feet, and before he could ask another question, she collapsed into his arms. Hey, are you okay?" James shook her gently, his voice filled with panic. She didn't respond. Her body was cold, too cold, like she had been out in the snow for hours. He didn't have time to think. He carried her inside and placed her gently on the couch near the fire. Her breathing was shallow, her lips pale and cracked. James grabbed a thick blanket and wrapped it around her, then hurried to the kitchen to heat some water. As he waited for the kettle to boil, his mind raced. Who was she? Where had she come from? And how had she survived out there in such a thin dress? When he returned to the couch, he noticed something strange. The woman's skin, which had been almost gray a moment ago, now seemed to have a faint glow to it. Her breathing had steadied, and her face looked calmer. James set the cup of hot water down on the table and sat beside her. "Who are you?" he asked softly. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, James thought he saw stars reflected in them. She looked at him with a mixture of fear and gratitude, but she didn't speak. Instead, she reached out a trembling hand and pointed to the window. James turned to look. The snow was still falling heavily, and nothing seemed out of place. "What is it?" he asked, turning back to her. She tried to speak, but the words didn't make sense. They sounded like a melody, soft and strange, filled with notes James had never heard before. "Are you lost?" he guessed, trying to understand. She nodded weakly, but then pointed to the window again, more urgently this time. James felt a chill run down his spine. Something about her expression told him she wasn't just pointing at the snow. She was warning him. He stood and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The trees swayed in the wind, their branches heavy with snow. But then he saw it, a faint red glow in the distance, moving slowly through the trees. "What is that?" he whispered, more to himself than to her. Before he could figure it out, the woman let out a soft cry. James turned to see her struggling to sit up, her glowing eyes wide with fear. Whatever was out there, it was coming. And James realized he might have just invited more than a freezing stranger into his chalet. The mysterious language. James stared at the woman as she slept, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The glow in her skin dimmed, but didn't fade completely. It pulsed faintly, almost like a heartbeat. Every time the light flickered, James felt his curiosity grow stronger, but so did his unease. The storm outside showed no signs of stopping, and the eerie red glow in the distance lingered in his mind. What had she been so afraid of? Suddenly, the woman stirred. Her eyes snapped open, and for a brief moment, they shone like two small suns. James stumbled back, startled, as she sat up with a jolt. "It's okay," he said quickly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're safe here. I'm not going to hurt you." The woman's gaze darted around the room, her body tense. Then she locked eyes with James, her expression softening just slightly. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but the sound that came out wasn't any language James had ever heard. It wasn't even human. Her words were like a symphony of notes, a mix of humming, singing, and static. Each syllable seemed to hang in the air, almost tangible, and James felt a strange sensation wash over him, as if her voice was trying to reach into his mind. What are you saying?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. The woman frowned, clearly frustrated. She glanced around the room, then grabbed a pencil and paper from the table beside her. Her movements were shaky but deliberate as she began to draw. James leaned in, his curiosity overtaking his fear. She sketched a series of symbols, elegant, curved lines that seemed to flow like water. They didn't look like letters or numbers, but they felt alive. "What is this?" James asked, pointing to the symbols. She tapped the paper and then pointed to the window, her glowing eyes fixed on him, pleading. "You're trying to tell me something about outside," James guessed, piecing it together. "Is it the light? The red glow?" At the mention of the red glow, her face twisted in fear. She nodded vigorously, then pointed to the symbols again. James's mind raced. She was trying to warn him. But about what? Was the glow a threat? Was someone, or something, coming for her? Before he could ask more, the woman grabbed his hand. Her touch was ice-cold but surprisingly gentle. She stared into his eyes and began to speak again, this time slower. The musical language seemed to shift, becoming softer, almost as if she were trying to mimic the rhythm of human speech. "You? Help," she said, the words halting and strained. James's eyes widened. You can understand me." She nodded, though she looked exhausted from the effort. She pointed to herself and said, "Elara." "Elara," James repeated, letting the name roll off his tongue. It felt strange but beautiful, like it didn't belong on Earth. "I'm James." Elara smiled faintly, but then grew serious again. She tapped the symbol she had drawn and said something in her language, her tone urgent. James stared at the symbols, trying to make sense of them. They looked like a map, but of what? A place? A warning? "Elara," he said carefully, "I want to help you, but I need to know. What are you afraid of?" She looked at him with those glowing eyes, her fear and desperation clear. Then, as if to answer his question, she reached out and pressed her palm against the frosted window. The frost melted instantly, and James saw something he hadn't noticed before. Tracks in the snow, leading straight to the chalet. They weren't human. "Elara," he whispered, his throat dry. "What's out there?" Elara's glowing eyes filled with tears as she whispered a single word, one that sent a chill down James's spine. "Hunt." The pieces clicked together in James's mind. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just wandering the mountains. It was looking for her. And now it had found them. Signs of danger. The quiet of the night was shattered by a distant, unnatural howl. James froze mid-step, his eyes darting to the window. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't any animal he had ever heard. The sound was low and guttural, yet sharp, like metal scraping against metal. Elara, who had been sitting near the fire, tensed. Her glowing eyes locked onto the window, and her pale hands gripped the edge of the couch so tightly that her knuckles turned translucent. "What is it?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. Instead, she stood, unsteady but determined, and pointed toward the window. Her lips moved, but no sound came out, only a faint hum, as if the very air around her was vibrating. James walked cautiously to the window and peered into the darkness. The snowstorm had eased slightly, but the moonlight revealed something unsettling. Tracks in the snow, not far from the chalet. The prints were large, deep, and clawed, like nothing James had ever seen before. They didn't follow the natural gait of an animal. Instead, they were staggered, uneven, as if whatever had made them moved in an unsettling, lurching rhythm. "Elara," James said, turning back to her. "What are those?" She didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the tracks, her expression a mix of fear and determination. Then, as if sensing something James couldn't, she grabbed his arm and pulled him away from the window. "Hey, what's going on?" he demanded, but her grip was surprisingly strong for someone so frail. She pointed to the door and said one word, her voice trembling but clear. "Hide." James blinked. "Hide? From what?" As if in response, the howling came again, closer this time. It was followed by a series of sharp clicks, like the sound of bones snapping. James's heart pounded as he realized the tracks weren't old. Whatever had made them was still out there, and it was moving toward the chalet. "Elara, we can't just hide," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "If something's coming, we need to be ready." Elara shook her head furiously, then grabbed a piece of paper and began drawing frantically. The symbols she sketched were jagged and chaotic, unlike the flowing designs she had made earlier. She tapped the page urgently, her glowing eyes pleading with him to understand. James stared at the symbols, his mind racing. They looked like warnings: danger, predator, death. The clicking sounds grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of snow under heavy footsteps. James glanced at the door, then at the window. The tracks were leading straight to them. "Elara," he said, his voice low and firm, "if you want me to help you, I need to know what we're dealing with. What's out there?" Elara hesitated, then pointed to herself and said, "Hunt." James frowned. "They're hunting you." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. Before he could respond, the sound of something heavy landing on the roof made him jump. The entire chalet shuddered under the weight. James grabbed the nearest object, a fire poker, and backed toward Elara. "Stay behind me," he said, though he wasn't sure what good a metal rod would do against whatever this was. The ceiling creaked, and the howling gave way to an eerie silence. James's pulse pounded in his ears as he waited, every muscle in his body tense. Then, slowly, a clawed hand, long, sinewy, and black as shadow, reached down and scratched at the windowpane. James tightened his grip on the fire poker, his mind screaming at him to run, to fight, to do anything but stand frozen. "Elara," he whispered, not daring to take his eyes off the window. "How do we stop them?" Elara stepped forward, her trembling hands glowing faintly. She placed her palm on James's chest, and for a brief moment, he felt a surge of warmth and energy course through him. She looked into his eyes and said softly, "Together." The scratching stopped, replaced by the sound of glass cracking. Whatever was out there wasn't waiting any longer. Bond beyond words. The chalet was silent, except for the crackling fire and the faint hum that seemed to emanate from Elara herself. She sat on the floor now, her knees drawn to her chest, staring at the symbols she had drawn earlier, her glowing eyes dimmed, her fear palpable. James leaned against the wall, still clutching the fire poker. His breaths came shallow, and his mind reeled with questions. He had seen enough to know she wasn't human, but the reality of what that meant was overwhelming. Whatever had left those clawed tracks outside was still out there, circling like a predator waiting for its prey. "Ilara," James began hesitantly. She glanced up at him, her expression weary. "You've got to help me understand. I need to know what's going on. Why are they after you?" She hesitated, then began to hum softly, a strange melodic sound that seemed to resonate deep within James's chest. It wasn't just noise. It was alive, like a language made of emotions rather than words. James frowned, frustrated. I can't." He trailed off, shaking his head. Ilara's face softened, and she tilted her head as if searching for something within him. Then she reached out, her glowing hand hovering just inches from his forehead. "What are you doing?" James asked, his voice laced with suspicion. She didn't answer. Instead, she gently touched his temple, and in an instant, his mind was flooded with images and sensations. He saw a planet bathed in golden light, its skies filled with shimmering towers that stretched endlessly upward. He felt the warmth of a sun unlike Earth's, and the peace of a world untouched by conflict. But then the visions shifted. Shadows swept across the golden light, and fire rained from the sky. The towers crumbled, and the air filled with cries of despair. A hulking, monstrous figure emerged, its red eyes burning with malice. James felt a wave of terror and grief that wasn't his own. It was Ilara's. He gasped and pulled away, breaking the connection. What was that? Ilara's eyes glistened with tears. She placed her hand on her chest, then pointed to the window. "Hunt," she said again, her voice barely a whisper. James sank to the floor, his head spinning. "They destroyed your home," he muttered, piecing it together. "You're the last one, aren't you?" Ilara nodded slowly, her tears falling silently. James felt a pang of guilt. He had spent years isolating himself from the world, running from his own pain. But here was something, who had lost everything and was still fighting to survive. "Ilara," he said gently, "I can't imagine what you've been through, but you're not alone anymore. I'll help you. I promise." She looked at him with a mix of hope and doubt, as if she wanted to believe him, but had been betrayed too many times before. To his surprise, she smiled faintly and said, "Together." James nodded, the weight of that single word sinking into him. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. But before he could say more, the eerie clicking sound returned, louder this time. It was right outside the door. James tensed, gripping the fire poker. Ilara's glow intensified, her fear giving way to resolve. She stood beside him, her frail frame seeming stronger now, more determined. The bond between them was fragile but undeniable. For the first time in years, James felt like he had something worth fighting for. The door creaked, and a shadow loomed in the frosted glass. "Ready?" he whispered. Ilara nodded, her glowing hand resting on his arm. "Then let's show them what together really means." The chase begins. The door exploded inward, sending splinters of wood flying across the room. James barely had time to react, pulling Ilara behind him as a hulking shadow filled the doorway. It wasn't human. Its elongated limbs and clawed hands moved with a horrifying precision. Its eyes burned red, scanning the room with an intelligence that made James's stomach churn. The creature let out a guttural growl, its gaze locking onto Ilara. "Go," James yelled, shoving her toward the back door. Ilara hesitated, her glowing eyes filled with fear, but James's urgency jolted her into action. She sprinted to the rear of the chalet, her light growing brighter as the creature lunged forward. James swung the fire poker with all his strength, striking the beast's arm. The sound was sickening, like metal hitting bone, but the creature barely flinched. Instead, it turned its focus to James, bearing jagged obsidian-like teeth. "You want her," James snarled, gripping the poker tighter. "You'll have to go through me first." The creature let out an ear-splitting shriek and charged. James dove to the side, narrowly avoiding its claws. He scrambled to his feet, adrenaline coursing through him, and bolted toward the back door. "Ilara!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. She was already outside, her glowing figure a beacon in the snowy darkness. But the red glow from the forest was closing in, dozens of smaller figures emerging from the shadows. James's heart sank. "There's more of them." Ilara turned to him, her hands trembling as she reached into her tattered clothing and pulled out a small metallic device. It hummed softly, the sound strangely soothing amidst the chaos. "What is that?" James asked, his breath visible in the freezing air. She placed the device in his hands, her glowing eyes meeting his. "Protect." James barely had time to question her as the first of the smaller creatures lunged toward them. Without thinking, he pressed the device's central button. A burst of light erupted from the device, blinding and warm. The creatures screeched, stumbling back as the light burned into their shadowy forms. The larger one from the chalet roared in fury, its movements frantic as it shielded its eyes. "Run!" Ilara shouted, her voice ringing clear for the first time. James grabbed her hand, and they sprinted through the snow, the light from the device pulsing in his grip like a heartbeat. The forest closed in around them, the cold biting at their faces, but the creatures weren't far behind. "Ilara, where are we going?" James panted, his legs burning with exhaustion. She pointed ahead, where a faint glimmer of light peeked through the trees. Her ship, her escape. The realization hit James like a jolt. They were so close, but the creatures were gaining. He glanced over his shoulder and saw the hulking figure bounding toward them, its red eyes blazing with rage. "Ilara, go," he shouted, pushing her forward. "I'll hold them off." She stopped, shaking her head violently. "No, together." James hesitated, her words striking something deep within him. For years, he had faced life alone, but this wasn't just about him anymore. He nodded. "Together." They turned as one, facing the approaching horde. Ilara raised her hands, her glow intensifying until it lit up the forest like a miniature sun. The creatures screeched, recoiling from the light, but the larger one pressed on, its claws tearing through the snow. James raised the device, his resolve hardening. "Let's end this." Sacrifice and courage. The forest lit up like a blazing star as Ilara's glow intensified, dragging the smaller creatures back. The air vibrated with her energy, and for a moment, James felt hope. But the hulking beast at the center of the chaos didn't retreat. It stood firm, its red eyes locked onto Ilara, unaffected by her light. With a guttural roar, it charged forward, its claws slicing through the snow like molten steel. "Ilara!" James shouted, moving to shield her. She pushed him aside, shaking her head. "No," she said firmly, her voice clear despite her exhaustion. She raised her hands, the light radiating from her palms growing brighter, almost too bright to look at. James squinted against the brilliance. "What are you doing?" Ilara's face was calm but resolute. "End it." He realized with horror what she meant. She was preparing to sacrifice herself to stop the creature. "No, there has to be another way," James yelled, grabbing her arm. "We can fight together." Ilara hesitated, her glowing eyes softening as they met his. "You saved me. Now I save you." James's grip tightened. "I didn't save you just to lose you now." The beast roared again, closing the distance between them in long, powerful strides. James felt the ground tremble beneath its weight. "Ilara, please," he begged. "Don't do this." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Ilara reached out and touched his chest, her glowing hand sending a wave of warmth through him. "Trust." Before James could respond, she turned back to the creature, her light blazing like the sun. The beast lunged, its claws slashing through the air. But Ilara thrust her hands forward, releasing a pulse of energy so powerful it knocked James off his feet. The light engulfed the creature, and it let out a deafening shriek. Its massive form began to dissolve, black smoke rising from its body as the energy consumed it. James scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. Ilara. As the light dimmed, he saw her collapse to the ground, her glow flickering like a dying flame. "No, no, no," James muttered, rushing to her side. He cradled her in his arms, her fragile frame feeling lighter than ever. Her breathing was shallow, and her once vibrant glow was now barely visible. "Ilara, stay with me," he pleaded, his voice breaking. Her eyes fluttered open, and she gave him a faint smile. "Safe," she whispered. James shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "Not without you. We're supposed to do this together, remember?" Ilara reached into her pocket and pulled out the small metallic device, pressing it into his hand. "Shipped near," she said, her voice fading. "Save us both." James looked at the device, its soft hum growing stronger. He understood. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a beacon. He stood, lifting Ilara in his arms. "I'm not letting you go," he said firmly, his resolve hardening. The forest was eerily quiet now, the other creatures driven away by Ilara's sacrifice. James stumbled through the snow, following the faint light she had pointed to earlier. "Just hold on," he whispered, his breath visible in the freezing air. "We're almost there." Ahead, a sleek alien ship came into view, its surface shimmering like liquid metal. The device in his hand pulsed rhythmically, unlocking the entrance as he approached. James stepped inside, the warmth of the ship enveloping them. Lights flickered on, and a soft, melodic voice echoed through the space. "Energy low," the ship announced. "Recharge required." James laid Ilara on a glowing platform that seemed to come alive beneath her. The ship's systems hummed as it began to envelop her in a cocoon of light. "Come on, Ilara," James said, gripping the edge of the platform. "You're not giving up, not now." The light grew brighter, and for a moment, James thought he saw her smile. A new beginning. The ship's interior pulsed with life, its walls glowing faintly in response to Ilara's energy. She lay on the platform, her fragile form encased in a cocoon of shimmering light. James sat beside her, his hands trembling as he watched the glow pulse rhythmically, like the beating of a heart. "Come on, Ilara," he whispered, his voice raw. "You've fought too hard to give up now." The melodic voice of the ship broke the silence. "Energy restoration. 75%. Vital signs stabilizing." James let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through him. She was holding on, but the ship's voice wasn't done. "Warning. Hostile entities approaching. Time to breach. 2 minutes." James's stomach dropped. He glanced at the screen near the control panel, where red dots blinked ominously. The creatures hadn't given up. They were coming for her. For them. He stood, his mind racing. What do I do? How do I stop them? The ship responded almost instantly. Launch sequence initiated. Manual override required for atmospheric exit. James turned to the controls, his heart pounding. He wasn't a pilot. He was just a rider who had run from life's challenges for too long. But as he looked back at Ilara, her fragile form glowing faintly, he knew he couldn't run this time. "Okay," he muttered to himself. "Let's figure this out." He placed his hands on the control panel, the strange symbols lighting up beneath his touch. They looked familiar, similar to the ones Ilara had drawn earlier. Slowly, he began to piece together their meanings, guided by the ship's soft prompts. "Launch sequence locked," the ship announced. "Hold for ignition." The ground beneath the ship began to rumble, and James felt a surge of hope. But just as the engines roared to life, a deafening crash echoed through the hull. The creatures had arrived. James turned to the entrance, where the metallic door groaned under the weight of the assault. The creatures' claws raked against it, their red eyes glowing like embers through the small viewport. "Ship," James called out, his voice steady despite the chaos. How long until we're in the air? 60 seconds, the ship replied. James clenched his fists. We don't have 60 seconds. He grabbed the small device Ilara had given him earlier and turned to face the door. The memory of her sacrifice, the way she had stood against the creatures without hesitation, burned in his mind. He wasn't going to let her down. As the door buckled, James pressed the button on the device. A blinding light erupted from it, filling the room with a searing brilliance. The creatures shrieked, their silhouettes writhing against the glow, but they didn't retreat. James gritted his teeth. Come on, you ugly bastards. Let's see how much you can take. The light intensified, and the creatures faltered, their movements sluggish and disoriented. Behind him, the ship's engines roared louder, and the platform supporting Ilara began to ascend into a protective chamber. Launch in 10 seconds, the ship announced. James felt a surge of relief, but then one of the creatures broke through the weakened door, its claws slashing toward him. He stumbled back, the device slipping from his hand as the light dimmed. The creature lunged, but before it could strike, a radiant beam shot from the chamber where Ilara lay. The creature froze mid-attack, its form dissolving into ash. James turned, stunned, as Ilara stepped from the chamber. Her glow was brighter than ever, her frailty replaced by an almost regal strength. Ilara, he breathed. She smiled faintly, her glowing eyes locking onto his. Together, she said softly. The remaining creatures hesitated, their instincts sensing they were no match for her now. Ilara raised her hand, and a wave of light erupted from her, sweeping through the ship and beyond. The creatures disintegrated, their red eyes extinguished. The ship's voice broke through the silence. Launch complete. Leaving atmosphere. James felt the weight lift from his chest as the ship ascended, the snow-covered forest shrinking below them. He turned to Ilara, who now stood beside him, her glow steady and calm. You did it, he said, his voice filled with awe. She shook her head. We did it. As the Earth faded into the distance, James realized he wasn't just leaving the planet behind. He was leaving behind the man he used to be. The one who ran from life, from connections, from hope. For the first time in years, he felt alive. Where to now? He asked, a small smile tugging at his lips. Ilara tilted her head, her glowing eyes gazing out at the endless stars. Home, she said simply, reaching out to take his hand. And together, they ventured into the unknown, a new beginning waiting among the stars.